You know what? I'm not sure that we should continue with this interview.
What did Matt Walsh say that made her want to end the interview? Well, he used a certain technique of argumentation, you might call it. Let's take a closer look.
Let's look at this argument.
Let's watch 5 video clips and look for a pattern. Ask yourself, what rhetorical move do they have in common?
While we were on the subject of national embarrassment, I had to ask the Congresswoman about Clarence Thomas and his BFF, Nazi swag collector Harlan Crow. I want to talk a little bit about Clarence Thomas.
Jordan Klepper and AOC, 2 Democrats, are talking about the possible removal of Republican Clarence Thomas from the Supreme Court. But for some reason, Klepper mentions Nazis?
Nazi swag collector Harlan Crow.
Joe Rogan is back on his podcast for the first time since recovering from COVID, and he's blasting those who mocked him for taking ivermectin, the anti-parasite drug also used for deworming horses.
Inside Edition is talking about Joe Rogan's use of ivermectin, a drug with multiple uses for humans, such as for intestinal strongyloidiasis, elephantiasis, river blindness, and for a wide range of viruses, including dengue fever, Zika, and yellow fever. But for some reason, they only mention that it's used for deworming horses?
Used for deworming horses.
I mean, Darwin did teach in The Descent of Man there are lower races and higher races.
Ken Ham is talking about why the theory of evolution is false and why creationism is true, but for some reason he mentions that Darwin, who was born in 1809, was, by modern standards, kind of racist.
There are lower races and higher races.
Everybody seems to be furious about trans people. Half of us are furious that they exist, and the other half are furious about what the other half is saying. But as tends to be the case, it's bigots on the right who are the main problem.
Professor Dave is making a video to, quote, clear up some of the ways that people are talking past each other, end quote, on the transgender subject. But for some reason, he starts off the video by claiming that Republicans hate the existence of trans people and are bigots.
It's bigots on the right who are the main problem.
One of the drugs used is Lupron, right? Which has actually been used to chemically castrate sex offenders.
Matt Walsh is talking about Lupron, a drug with many uses, such as for prostate cancer, endometriosis, uterine fibroids, precocious puberty, and for in vitro fertilization. But for some reason, he only mentions that it's used for the chemical castration of sex offenders.
Has actually been used to chemically castrate sex offenders.
If you haven't guessed it already, the rhetorical strategy common to all these video clips is what is known as poisoning the well. This is where a speaker uses pathos, or in other words, language that arouses an emotional response, to bias his audience. It's a subtle form of manipulation, and it's also a type of informal logical fallacy. So let's quickly go over those clips again and point out how they are poisoning the well. When you think of Clarence Thomas, they want you to think
Nazi swag collector Harlan Crow.
Nazi. When you think of ivermectin, they want you to think
Used for deworming horses.
crazy people using animal drugs. When you think of evolution, they want you to think
There are lower races and higher races.
racism. When you think about Republicans, they want you to think
It's bigots on the right who are the main problem.
hateful bigots. When you think about puberty blockers, they want you to think
Chemically castrate sex offenders.
sex offenders. Now, perhaps Clarence Thomas really is awful, and maybe so are ivermectin, evolution, Republicans, and puberty blockers. But even if that's true, you don't want to come to that conclusion based on irrational emotional reasons. For example, because you were tricked into feeling a certain way by a poisoned well argument. No, ideally, you'd want to come to a true conclusion because you heard all the evidence and thought carefully about it. By the way, do you see how I poisoned the well just now? Moving on, here's one last example.
Of course, I know there's going to be queer activist haters that are going to be commenting below my video with all of the nonsense.
See how she poisoned the well? She is preempting any criticism she might receive by calling those critics ahead of time haters whose comments are nonsense. She is subtly, and probably unintentionally, encouraging irrationality. But you don't want to be irrational. You don't want to be led around by your emotions like a bull by the nose ring. Instead, whenever someone is trying to persuade you of something, try to ignore the emotionally charged language and really try to find out.
Does it make any sense?